You think your problem is lack of motivation? Wrong. Your problem is you think like a child. Short-term comfort, short-term validation, short-term dopamine. You wake up and ask, what do I feel like doing today? That question alone proves you've already lost. Men who build power don't operate on feelings. They operate on commands. And right now, your mind is weak because it speaks a language built for losers. Let me tell you something most people are too soft to admit. Your internal dialogue is broken. The voice in your head, it's not yours. It's a weak, undisciplined, excuse-making parasite that's been trained by comfort, social media, and instant gratification. You don't think in power, you think in impulses, and that's exactly why you stay stuck, repeating the same year of your life over and over again. This is where speaking in tongues comes in, but not the way you've been told. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about rewriting the language inside your head, because the language you use internally determines your identity, and your identity determines your results. If your inner voice says, I'll do it later, you're finished. If it negotiates, hesitates, complains, you are already operating from a position of weakness. Powerful men don't negotiate with themselves. They issue commands. They speak a different tongue, a language of execution, dominance, and certainty. No maybe, no I'll try. It's I do, it's I move, it's I win. That's it. Clean, sharp, final. Right now, your problem isn't effort, it's translation. You're translating your goals through a weak mental language. You say you want success, but your internal voice says, not today. You say you want discipline, but your mind whispers, take it easy. That mismatch destroys long-term progress every single time. Because success requires consistency, and consistency is impossible when your inner voice is soft. You need to understand this clearly. Short-term thinking is not just a habit. It's a language. It's the tongue of average men. It prioritizes comfort over growth, ease over strength, now over later. And if that's the language you speak internally, then no amount of external motivation will ever fix you. You will sabotage yourself every time. So what do dominant men do differently? They reprogram the voice. They kill the weak language and replace it with commands. They don't wake up and ask how they feel. They decide what gets done. Their internal dialogue sounds like orders, not suggestions. Train, work, execute, no emotion, no hesitation, just action. This is where identity shifts. Because once you start speaking this new tongue internally, you stop being the guy who hopes and you become the man who enforces. Discipline stops being something you chase and becomes something you are. Control stops being a struggle and becomes your default state. That's real power, not hype, not motivation, control. And here's the brutal truth you don't want to hear. If you can't control your own thoughts, you deserve your current life. If your mind is weak, your results will be weak. Period. There is no workaround, no shortcut, no hack. Either you dominate your internal language or it dominates you. You don't have a motivation problem. You have a command problem. The voice inside your head is neutral. It's trained, conditioned, and right now it's operating like a weak manager negotiating with a lazy employee. Every time you think, I'll start later, or I don't feel like it, you're not just having a harmless thought. You're reinforcing a system where hesitation wins and action loses. That system compounds. It becomes your default, and defaults dictate outcomes. Most people never question the quality of their internal dialogue. They assume thinking is automatic and therefore trustworthy. It's not. Your mind is a programmable tool, and if you don't program it deliberately, it gets programmed by comfort, distractions, and low standards. Social media, entertainment, and instant gratification don't just waste your time, they rewrite your internal language. They teach your brain to prioritize ease, novelty, and emotional comfort. So when it's time to do something difficult, your mind resists, negotiates, and delays. Not because you're incapable, but because you've trained it that way. Look closely at how you speak to yourself during pressure. Do you issue clear instructions, or do you open debates? Weak minds debate. They say, maybe I should, I'll try, I'll see how I feel. That language is soft, uncertain, and it creates loopholes. Loopholes become excuses, and excuses become patterns. Strong minds eliminate ambiguity. They don't ask for permission. They define the outcome and move. Start now. Finish this. No distractions. It's direct, it's final, and it leaves no room for negotiation. This isn't about being aggressive for the sake of it. It's about precision, High performers operate with clarity because clarity removes friction. When your internal commands are vague, your actions become inconsistent. When your internal commands are sharp, your actions become predictable. Predictability is power. It means you can rely on yourself regardless of mood, environment, or external pressure. That's the difference between someone who occasionally performs and someone who consistently executes. You've probably experienced this without realizing it. Think about a time when you had no choice when something had to get done. Notice how your mind didn't argue. It didn't say later. It locked in and executed. That's the version of your mind you need permanently, not occasionally. The problem is, most people only access that state under external pressure deadlines, fear, consequences. The goal is to internalize that pressure so your standards, not your circumstances, drive your behavior. Every weak thought you allow is a vote for a weaker identity. Identity isn't built in grand moments. It's built in micro decisions repeated daily. If your inner voice constantly gives you exits, you become the type of person who takes them. If your inner voice removes exits, you become the type of person who finishes. This is mechanical, not emotional. You don't rise to your goals, you fall to your systems, and your internal language is the core of that system. There's also a cost most people ignore: cognitive fatigue from indecision. When your mind debates every action, you burn energy before you even start. Decision-making becomes exhausting because you've turned simple tasks into internal conflicts. Strong internal language eliminates that. It reduces decisions to directives. Less thinking, more doing. Over time, this compounds into speed, efficiency, and confidence because you trust your own execution. If you're serious about changing this, you need to audit your internal vocabulary. Remove weak phrases entirely. Later, maybe. I'll try. Just this once. These are not harmless words. They are triggers for an action. Replace them with non-negotiable commands. Keep them short, specific, and immediate. Your brain responds better to clarity than complexity. The simpler the command, the faster the execution. Consistency here is everything. You don't fix this in a day. You fix it by catching yourself every time the weak voice appears and overriding it instantly. No delay, no compromise. At first, it will feel forced because you're breaking a habit. Then it becomes natural because you're building a new one. Eventually, it becomes automatic, and that's when you've taken control. This is the part most people avoid because it requires responsibility. You can't blame lack of opportunity, bad luck, or external circumstances when the real issue is how you think. But once you accept that, you gain leverage, because if your results are driven by your internal language, then changing that language changes everything that follows. Every time you choose what feels good now over what builds you later, you're not making a small decision. You're setting a direction. Most people treat short-term thinking like it's harmless. Like skipping one task or delaying one action. Doesn't matter. That's a lie they tell themselves to stay comfortable. In reality, every short-term decision is a vote for a weaker future. You're either building momentum or eroding it, and erosion is silent. It doesn't feel dangerous in the moment, but it compounds until your potential is unrecognizable. The problem isn't that you want comfort, everyone does. The problem is that you've trained yourself to prioritize it. Your brain is wired to seek immediate reward, and if you don't control that instinct, it will control you. That's why scrolling, procrastinating, and avoiding difficulty feel natural. They give you instant satisfaction with zero effort, but that satisfaction comes with a cost. It conditions your mind to expect ease, and when real work shows up, work that requires focus, patience, and discipline, your system rejects it. Look at the pattern. You plan something meaningful, something that could actually move your life forward. Then a small discomfort appears: fatigue, boredom, resistance, and suddenly your mind starts negotiating. I'll do it later. I need a break. Just 5 minutes. That's the moment where most people lose, not because the task is hard, but because their standard is low. They allow temporary feelings to override long-term objectives. And once that pattern repeats enough times, it becomes your identity. Someone who starts but doesn't finish. Short-term thinking destroys progress because it breaks consistency. And without consistency, nothing compounds. You can have talent, ambition, even a clear plan. But if your actions are inconsistent, your results will always be average. Consistency requires you to act when you don't feel like it, to prioritize outcomes over emotions. That's where most people fail. They wait for the perfect mood, the right energy, the ideal moment. Those conditions rarely exist, and even when they do, they're temporary. Relying on them guarantees inconsistency. There's also a deeper issue. Short-term thinking distorts your perception of time. It tricks you into believing you have more of it than you actually do. You tell yourself, I'll start tomorrow, as if tomorrow is guaranteed and as if delay has no consequence. But time doesn't pause for your hesitation. Every day you delay is a day you don't get back. And those days accumulate. Weeks become months. Months become years, and suddenly you're looking at a life that never reached its potential. Not because you lacked ability, but because you kept choosing now over next. High-level performers understand this differently. They don't see tasks in isolation. They see trajectories. One disciplined action today isn't just about today. It's about the version of themselves it reinforces. They think in terms of identity and momentum, not convenience. When faced with a choice between comfort and growth, they default to growth because they understand the long-term payoff. It's not emotional for them, it's strategic. You also need to recognize the hidden cost of constant short-term decisions. Loss of self-trust. Every time you say you'll do something and then don't, you weaken your own credibility. Over time, you stop believing your own commitments. That's why some people set goals and feel nothing they broke in so many promises to themselves that their words carry no weight. Rebuilding that trust requires alignment between what you say and what you do consistently over time. The solution isn't complicated, but it's uncomfortable. You need to start valuing long-term outcomes more than short-term feelings. That means making decisions based on where they lead, not how they feel. It means recognizing that discomfort is not a signal to stop. It's often a signal that you're doing something that matters. Instead of avoiding it, you use it as confirmation that you're moving in the right direction. This shift changes everything because it removes the illusion that you can have long-term success with short-term habits. You can't. The math doesn't work. If your daily actions are driven by comfort, your long-term results will reflect that mediocre, inconsistent, and far below your potential. But if your daily actions are driven by discipline and foresight, those actions compound into something far more powerful. Progress that doesn't depend on how you feel, only on what you do. Pay attention to the words you use when you talk to yourself because they are not neutral. They are instructions. Most people assume identity is something abstract, something you discover over time. That's inaccurate. Identity is constructed, and the primary building material is language. The phrases you repeat internally don't just describe your reality, they shape it. If your inner dialogue is filled with hesitation, excuses, and soft commitments, you're actively programming yourself to behave in alignment with those patterns. You don't rise above the language you tolerate. If your mind constantly says, I'll try, you've already accepted failure as an option. Trying leaves space for retreat. It's a word designed to protect your ego, not to produce results. Compare that to decisive language. I will, I do, this gets done. There's no ambiguity there. The brain responds differently to certainty. It prioritizes action when the instruction is clear and non-negotiable. This isn't motivational theory. It's behavioral conditioning. Your nervous system follows the commands it receives most consistently. Think about how you describe yourself during difficulty. Do you say, I'm not disciplined, I'm bad at this, I always mess up? Those statements might feel honest, but they're destructive. You're not just describing a moment, you're defining a pattern. The brain takes repeated statements as identity markers and aligns behavior accordingly. If you label yourself as inconsistent, your actions will reinforce inconsistency because that's the standard you've set. Identity becomes a self-fulfilling system. This is why high performers are extremely precise with their internal language. They don't allow casual negativity or vague commitments because they understand the cost. When they say something internally, it carries weight, it's deliberate, it's aligned with the identity they're building. They don't say, I hope I stay consistent. They say, I am consistent. And then they act in a way that validates that statement. The alignment between language and behavior is what creates stability. There's also a structural issue in how most people think. Their internal dialogue is reactive rather than directive. It responds to circumstances instead of shaping them. When something goes wrong, the mind immediately generates explanations, justifications, and emotional responses. That's passive. Directive thinking is different. It overrides reaction with instruction. Instead of this is hard, it becomes adapt and continue. Instead of I'm tired, it becomes maintain output. The situation doesn't change, but the response doesn't. That response determines the outcome. You need to understand that language isn't just about words. It's about standards. Every phrase you allow internally sets a boundary for what you accept from yourself. If your life sucks this once, you've lowered the standard. If you allow, I'll do it later, you've introduced delay as an option. Over time, these small allowances accumulate into a system where discipline is optional and inconsistency is normal. That's how average is built quietly, through repeated tolerance of weak language. There's a reason decisive people appear more confident. It's not because they feel different, it's because they communicate differently with themselves. Their internal dialogue eliminates uncertainty. When there's no internal debate, there's no hesitation in action. That creates speed, and speed creates advantage. While others are still thinking, negotiating, and second-guessing, they've already moved. This isn't about personality, it's about structure. Anyone can build it, but most don't because it requires awareness and discipline. Another critical factor is repetition. One strong statement won't change your identity. Consistency in language does. The brain adapts to what it hears most often, especially when it comes from you. If you repeatedly reinforce a standard, clear, direct, uncompromising, it becomes automatic. Over time, the gap between intention and action closes because there's no conflicting input. The system is aligned. You also need to eliminate contradiction. Saying, I want success while thinking, I'll do it later, creates internal conflict. The brain doesn't operate well under conflicting instructions. It defaults to the easier option, which is usually inaction. Alignment removes that conflict. When your goals, language, and actions all point in the same direction, execution becomes straightforward. Not easy, but clear. Most people underestimate how much control they have here. They look for external changes, new strategies, new environments, new tools, while ignoring the internal system that drives all of it. If your language remains weak, every external improvement will be limited. But when your internal dialogue becomes precise, directive, and consistent, everything else starts to align with it. Your decisions become sharper, your actions more reliable, and your results more predictable. You keep waiting to feel disciplined before you act, and that's exactly why you stay stuck. Discipline is not an emotion you unlock, it's a standard you impose. The moment you tie your actions to how you feel, you've already lost control. Feelings are unstable, inconsistent, and easily influenced. If they're in charge, your output will always fluctuate. Serious operators don't ask for emotional permission. They define what gets done and then they execute, regardless of internal resistance. There's a fundamental misunderstanding that discipline is something you gradually build by getting inspired or motivated. That's false. Discipline begins the second you remove choice. As long as your mind believes there's an option to delay, avoid, or negotiate, it will take it. The human brain is wired for efficiency, and efficiency often means choosing the easiest path. If you leave the door open, it will walk through it every time. Enforcing discipline means closing that door completely. No alternatives, no loopholes, no just this once. Look at how you approach tasks right now. You probably give yourself flexible timelines, vague commitments, and room to adjust based on your mood. That flexibility feels comfortable, but it destroys consistency. High-level performance requires rigidity in execution, not rigidity in thinking, but in standards. The task gets done because it's scheduled, not because you feel ready. You train at a fixed time. You work at a fixed time. You produce at a fixed standard. Over time, this removes the need for constant decision-making. You don't wake up and think you follow the structure you've already set. The reason enforcement works is because it shifts the source of control from emotion to identity. When you say, I am disciplined, that statement is meaningless unless it's backed by non-negotiable behavior. Enforcement is how you make that identity real. You don't prove discipline by doing what's easy. You prove it by doing what you don't want to do repeatedly until it becomes automatic. That's when the identity locks in. There's also a psychological effect that most people overlook. Every time you enforce an action despite resistance, you strengthen your authority over your own mind. You're teaching your brain that discomfort is not a valid excuse to stop. Over time, resistance loses its power because it no longer changes your behavior. It still shows up, but it becomes irrelevant. That's the point where discipline stops feeling like a struggle and starts functioning as a system. Most people fail here because they rely on bursts of intensity instead of consistent enforcement. They push hard for a few days, maybe a week, and then they relax when the initial motivation fades. That cycle is predictable and ineffective. Real discipline is quiet, repetitive, and sustained. It doesn't need hype. It doesn't need external validation. It operates the same way every day, regardless of circumstances. That's what makes it powerful. It's reliable. You also need to remove emotional language from your process. Phrases like, I don't feel like it, or I'm not in the mood are irrelevant. They don't provide useful information. They just justify inaction. Replace them with operational thinking. What needs to be done? When does it get done? Execute. The less you entertain emotional narratives, the more efficient your system becomes. Efficiency leads to consistency, and consistency drives results. Another critical factor is environment. If your surroundings constantly offer distractions and easy alternatives, enforcement becomes harder. Discipline isn't just internal, it's structural. You design your environment to reduce friction for productive actions and increase friction for distractions. That means removing triggers that lead to avoidance and setting up systems that support execution. When your environment aligns with your standards, enforcement requires less effort. You're not trying to become a different person overnight. You're trying to build a system where the right actions happen by default. That system is built to repetition and enforcement, not inspiration. Each time you follow through on a commitment, you reinforce the pattern. Each time you break it, you weaken it. Over time, these small decisions accumulate into a stable identity. The reality is simple but uncomfortable. Discipline is a choice you make repeatedly, not a trait you wait to acquire. The sooner you stop searching for it and start enforcing it, the sooner your actions will align with your goals. You keep chasing motivation like it's a resource you can depend on, and that's exactly why your performance is unstable. Motivation is unpredictable by design. It rises, it falls, and it disappears the moment things get uncomfortable. If your system requires motivation to function, then your system is broken. High-level operators don't build their lives on something that fluctuates. They build on standards fixed, non-negotiable, and independent of how they feel in the moment. Think about how you approach your work. On days you feel energized, you move fast, you execute, you get things done. On days you don't, everything slows down. You delay, you justify, you look for easier tasks. That inconsistency is not random. It's the direct result of relying on motivation. You've trained yourself to act only when it's convenient. And convenience doesn't produce results at scale. It produces average output, unpredictable progress, and a constant gap between what you intend and what you actually do. Standards eliminate that gap. A standard is a rule you follow regardless of internal state. It doesn't ask for your mood, your energy, or your enthusiasm. It defines the minimum level of execution that must happen every time. When you operate on standards, the question is no longer, do I feel like doing this? It becomes, is this required? If the answer is yes, it gets done. That shift removes friction because it replaces emotional decision-making with a simple objective criterion. Most people avoid standards because they feel restrictive. They want flexibility, freedom, the ability to adjust based on how they feel. That sounds appealing, but it's a trap. Flexibility without discipline turns into inconsistency. Inconsistency destroys momentum. And without momentum, even small tasks feel heavy because you're constantly starting from zero. Standards create continuity. They allow progress to build because your actions are predictable and repeatable. There's also a deeper issue with motivation that people ignore. It creates dependency. When you rely on it, you start looking for external triggers, videos, music, quotes, environments to generate the feeling you think you need. That dependency weakens your internal control. You're no longer self-directed. You're stimulus-driven. If the trigger isn't there, you stall. If it is, you move. That's not control, that's reaction. Standards reverse that dynamic. They place control entirely within your system. You don't need to feel ready because readiness is irrelevant. You've already decided what happens. This builds a different kind of confidence, not the temporary confidence that comes from feeling good, but the stable confidence that comes from knowing you will act regardless of conditions. That reliability is what separates consistent performers from everyone else. You can see this clearly in any high-performance environment. Professionals don't wait for motivation to show up before they train, work, or compete. They operate on schedules, routines, and expectations. The work gets done because it's part of the system, not because they're inspired. Over time, this creates a compounding effect. Small, consistent actions accumulate into significant results, while inconsistent bursts of effort produce very little. Another advantage of standards is efficiency. When your actions are defined in advance, you reduce the cognitive load of decision-making. You don't waste energy debating whether to act, you simply follow the plan. That preserved energy can then be directed toward execution and improvement. This is why disciplined individuals often appear more focused and productive. It's not that they have more time or energy, it's that they use less of it on unnecessary decisions. The transition from motivation to standards requires a shift in perspective. You have to stop asking what you want to do and start defining what must be done. That means setting clear, measurable expectations for your behavior and holding yourself accountable to them. Not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but consistently. At first, it will feel rigid because you're removing the option to negotiate. Over time, it becomes natural because your system adapts. You also need to accept that standards expose weaknesses. When you operate on motivation, you can always blame a lack of energy or inspiration. When you operate on standards, there's no hiding. If something doesn't get done, it's because you didn't enforce the rule. That level of accountability is uncomfortable, but it's necessary for growth. It forces you to confront reality instead of avoiding it. The difference between average and exceptional is not intensity. It's consistency. Motivation can give you intensity for short periods, but it cannot sustain it. Standards can. And sustained effort, applied over time, is what produces results that actually matter. You think you're in control because you can make decisions when it's convenient, but control isn't measured in easy moments. It's exposed under pressure, distraction, and resistance. That's where most people fail. They assume they're thinking clearly, but in reality, they're reacting to impulses they've never trained themselves to manage. If your thoughts shift based on mood, environment, or comfort, then you're not in control, your conditions are. Your mind is not designed to serve you by default. It's designed to conserve energy and avoid discomfort. That means it will constantly push you toward what's easy, familiar, and immediately rewarding. If you don't actively override that tendency, it becomes your operating system. You start making decisions that feel good in the moment, but undermine your long-term direction. Over time, those decisions compound into patterns, and those patterns define your life. Not because you chose them deliberately, but because you never challenged them. Impulse is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as weakness. It shows up as justification, as logic that sounds reasonable in the moment. You've worked hard, take a break. You can start tomorrow. This won't matter in the long run. Each statement feels harmless, but it shifts your behavior away from what actually needs to be done. The danger is not in a single decision, it's in the repetition. When impulses consistently override intention, intention becomes irrelevant. Controlling your mind means creating separation between stimulus and response. Most people collapse that gap. Something happens, a thought appears, and they act on it immediately. There's no filter, no evaluation, no deliberate choice. That's automatic behavior, and automatic behavior is rarely aligned with long-term objectives. Building control requires inserting a pause, just enough space to recognize the thought and decide whether it serves your goals. That pause is where discipline operates. This is not about suppressing thoughts. You don't eliminate impulses. You learn to ignore them when they're not useful. The thought, "I don't feel like doing this," will still appear. The difference is that it no longer dictates your action. You acknowledge it, then proceed anyway. That's control. It's quiet, consistent, and often invisible, but it's the foundation of every high-level outcome. Another critical factor is attention. What you focus on expands, and most people have no control over their attention. It gets pulled in every direction: notifications, entertainment, random distractions. Each shift in attention weakens your ability to stay engaged with meaningful work. Over time, this fragments your thinking. You lose depth, focus, and the ability to sustain effort. Controlling your mind means controlling your attention, deciding what deserves it, and protecting it from everything that doesn't. There's also the issue of self-negotiation. When you allow internal debates about whether to act, you create instability. One part of your mind sets a goal, another part argues against it, and you end up stuck in the middle. That conflict drains energy and reduces clarity. Eliminating unnecessary negotiation simplifies the process. The decision is made once, and execution follows. This doesn't remove flexibility where it's needed, but it removes hesitation where it's harmful. You need to understand that control is built through repetition, not intention. Deciding to be focused or disciplined once doesn't change anything. Consistently overriding impulses does. Each time you choose the action aligned with your goals, instead of the one aligned with comfort, you strengthen that pathway. Over time, it becomes easier because the behavior is reinforced. The opposite is also true. Every time you give in to distraction or avoidance, you reinforce that pattern instead. There's a cost to not developing this control, and it's often underestimated. Without it, your results become inconsistent, your progress slows, and your confidence erodes. You start to question your ability, not realizing the issue isn't capability, it's regulation. You're capable of more, but your system isn't structured to deliver it consistently. Control also changes how you handle setbacks. When your mind is stable, you don't overreact to failure or get pulled off course by temporary challenges. You assess, adjust, and continue. Without control, setbacks trigger emotional responses that lead to avoidance or overcorrection. That instability keeps you from maintaining a steady trajectory. Ultimately, controlling your mind is about alignment. Your thoughts, decisions, and actions need to point in the same direction. When they do, progress becomes linear and predictable. When they don't, you get friction, delay, and inconsistency. The difference isn't talent or opportunity. It's whether you trained your mind to execute deliberately or allowed it to operate on impulse. Andrew Tate doesn't win because he's lucky. He wins because his mind doesn't speak the same language as yours. There's no room for weakness in his internal dialogue. And until you develop that same ruthless clarity, you'll keep watching other men win while you make excuses. So here's your reality check. Your future isn't being destroyed by lack of opportunity. It's being destroyed by the way you think in the present. Every weak thought, every delay, every excuse, it compounds. And while you're busy choosing comfort today, you're quietly killing your tomorrow. Fix the language. Kill the softness. Speak in commands. Or stay exactly where you are. Your move.